So we've talked a bit about our CPU in terms of where it's located on our motherboard and how it interacts with our buses. But what about our CPU slots? Where does the CPU actually fit into on the motherboard, and how are the slots different? These are important to know, especially for our exam. This is the single edge contact cartridge. Advantageous, of course, because it's very easy to install. You just slide it right down in there and it's good to go. But it lacks in the fact that this is very extended from the motherboard, and this is going to make it very hard to fit this inside of a computer case. It's not very streamlined. It's not very efficient. One of our older CPU slots would be what's known as our plastic dual inline package, or PDIP. The plastic dual inline package will actually fit into the motherboard like so. We'll have the chip, this is from a side view, with two sets of pins from the side view and then from the top view, which fit directly down into a housing. Now this is different than the square chip, CPUs that we'll see now with pins on them, and then in that the plastic dual inline packaging has almost like an insect, I'd say, where the legs are spread out on either side and it just fits down into the packaging, into the housing. And then with that, we can install our CPU. After that, we went ahead and we moved on to our PGA, pin grid array. Now, our pin grid array is actually a square CPU with pins all along the underside. Now, these pins are very small, as we see with this example, and they have to line up exactly with the holes that are on our CPU, because if we don't, then we'll bend them. And if we can't straighten them out, which is a very, very time-consuming process, or if they break, then we have to get a new CPU. Now, this pin grid array, when looking at it from our top view doesn't have any pins, but what our top view does have is one of the corners will be filled in with a gold color. Now, this gold arrow actually matches up on when we place our CPU into the slot on our motherboard. The slot will have all the receiving holes, and one of the edges will see an outline of that corner being taken out. We want to make sure that when we place the CPU in the slot, because it's square, that corner matches up in the corner when we place them on top of each other. We see we have the CPU here. The heat sink, which normally sits on top, has been removed, and there's a small lever. We want to disengage our lever, and we do have tools which make this easier, but we're going to just use our hands just for demonstration purposes. And we'll locate the small arrow on this chip, which is right now at the top right. However, the arrow on the receiving end is at the bottom left, so we'll switch it around. Once it's oriented properly, then we would place the chip on. Now, this would be done with it flat, and make sure that all the pins are aligned properly. And then we would have the gentle force down in order to seat everything. And then after it was all seated, we would re-engage our arm. Now, with our toolkits, we do have tools which make this easier in order to place and also to remove our CPU chip, because again, it's critical not to bend or especially not break any of the pins which are on the CPU. Now, the third type of CPU socket that we want to talk about is actually the LGA, which is the LAN grid array. Now, with the LAN grid array, it's kind of flipped around from the pin grid array, whereas the LAN grid array, instead of having the pins on the CPU itself, the pins on this instance are actually on the motherboard. Now, this makes it a little bit easier when we're placing the actual CPU onto the motherboard, but we do have to realize that we're at a disadvantage here if we bend any of the pins, especially if we break them. We're no longer getting a new CPU, now we're getting a new motherboard. So we want to be especially careful. This motherboard, we have an example of a LAN grid array. We see here it has a little bit of a different housing here, and we would remove the locking mechanism and open the housing, and we have all of our pins on the motherboard itself. We would then place our CPU and close and lock. And we would use our technician's tools that we would have available to us in order to make sure that locked in there properly. Just as a review, we have our PDIP, which is our plastic dual inline package CPU, our single edge contact cartridge, which we showed earlier. We have our PGA, where the pins are on the CPU, and we have our LGA, the land grid array, where our pins are on the motherboard.